conceptions about what the right or wrong ways to organize society are. In particular, this is likely effective on them because if you're young, you don't have tons of discussions about relationships prior to this. So discussions about things like sex are often viewed as taboo in families, and this is your first exposure to discussions about relationships. The second, though, is what Ashish told you, which is the nature of argument you are making. The problem with this gov bench is they just act like discrimination exists exogenously. There is just this idea of homophobia or discrimination that exists in people's lives without really investigating where it comes from. Why is this argument effective? Because discrimination emerges from fear of the unknown. For example, if you're homophobic, you haven't had tons of exposure to gay people before, so they seem weird. You've heard stereotypes about gay people told about you to your family. People aren't against intercaste marriage for unexplainable reasons. They hear these relationships end in collapse. They hear these relationships are fundamentally wrong or an affront to people's access to economic opportunity. They hear that these lives end poorly. The problem is, these are explicit lies that often get challenged in these movies. We hear they are likely to be tragedies with zero explanation of why. The reason they are unlikely to be tragedies is Ashish explains that if the filmmakers and the artists and the producers are likely more liberal than the general population, in many cases they are doing this art ideologically rather than purely as a result to gain access to profit. So for example, if you're a filmmaker or if you're a director, in many cases you have a personal idea or agenda to push on people. You want to make people believe that queer relationships are okay and good because those are the values you were raised with, in which case that is an incentive for you to incorporate ideas like this relationship ends in happiness. On top of the gov bench's own claim that apparently this will mislead you about relationships because people's problems will just get fixed. Apparently DPM says bad relationships will be papered over and have happy endings. That proves in many cases you're unlikely to have tragic depictions of how these relationships happen. As a consequence, you're likely to have a lot of your pre-existing stereotypes about bad kinds of relationships busted by the existence of these movies, which highlights where this discrimination comes from. But third, people's politics are not actually very central to them. Most people don't care that much about politics. They don't care that much about their underlying ideologies. Rather, they see an actor participating in this relationship, view them as a role model. They're like, this person who I really admire thinks it's okay, therefore it must be okay. These three responses demonstrate that their claim that you just default to not believing in any form of change are unlikely. They say you see it as more threatening and salient. You see it around you. It is a threat to you, and therefore you fight against it. I want to weigh against this claim. I don't think this claim is comparative at all. Because think about how opening government thought advocacy happens. And in fact, even how closing government thought advocacy happens. Through social movements that are far more in your face. It's protests telling you that you are homophobic. We live in a homophobic society. If that is your exclusive alternative, you're far more likely to feel threatened by these narratives being pushed on you rather than a gradual process of not pushing these narratives on you through argument, but rather telling you this is something that belongs in mainstream society. The next claim, however, is pop culture has lagged behind liberalization and because big studios pander to the majority norm. There are a number of problems with this. One, controversial takes attract larger audiences. Some people will be upset, but the fact that they are upset makes them want to engage in a really competitive film market. Like if you're producing a lot of art and this art already appeals to a bunch of the audience that you currently have, there's no particular reason to engage with one piece of art over another piece of art. But hearing the buzz around a piece of art that is transitional or challenging your pre-existing beliefs, even if you hate it, is a reason to come that creates hype that causes people who are more moderate to also turn up. No, thank you. Second, I've explained why there's often an ideological drive. They say bureaucrats decide where funding gets allocated. I'm not actually sure why this is true. Artists get substantial amounts of creative freedom because theirs are the names that are recognized, not the names of bureaucrats. When Kendrick Lamar releases an album, he gets tons of creative freedom to do the political messaging he wants for this reason. Finally, they say minority filmmakers are compared to what's already in pop culture. I don't think this argument makes sense because our whole point is we don't want minority filmmakers appealing to just minority audiences, but rather art that appeals more broadly. Now let me weigh this extension against opening opposition explicitly and explain why Ashish's contribution is distinct to what opening opposition argues in this regard. Opening opposition's argument in this regard is as follows. If you have tons of queer pop culture that helps improve perceptions of queer people, before moving on, okay?
Status Quo has dozens and dozens of popular love narratives a year, mostly embedded in bigger works, as we explained. So why isn't a smaller amount of these narratives on our side enough to trigger the impacts of your extension?
No, but the whole point is you need a large amount of these narratives for them to be mainstream rather than a couple of minority artists. Okay, let me weigh against opening opposition. Opening opposition basically says, if you have interracial relationships in pop culture, which you statistically do because you have a ton, you help improve perceptions through reasons like if you see these stories, they're not so different than yours, you realize minorities are not fundamentally that different. Here's what OO doesn't actually answer. Why does pop culture broadcast stories about unconventional forms of love specifically to audiences who do not already buy in? Because they're like, oh, this pop culture exists because it's large, there's a statistical fraction. They don't explain why this is not just marketed to liberals, why moderate people buy this art, or why this art is produced en masse. In particular, there are 3 problems with the way opening opposition makes this argument. 1, as opening government claims, it's possible that it's not the dominant narrative and is limiting. They don't explain why pop culture is in fact liberal, rather than aligning with conservative social norms. Ashish answers this question by explaining why it's more liberal. Second, even if it's a significant part of pop culture, why is it not just to ordinary liberal audiences? They say the word moderate without answering it. And finally, why is love unique in this regard? Ashish answers why love is unique, which is love is one of the few places you're willing to change your mind on the basis of pop culture specifically, as opposed to other areas of politics. Since we answer why this art exists, we beat opening opposition as well.
Thank you, Awkward.